Now we move to the first technical session of the day. Under technical session 2B, the deliberations will focus on standards for infrastructure. For this, I invite Professor CVR Murty, Director, Indian Institute of Technology, Jodhpur, as Chair, and Mr. Brendan Moon, Queensland Reconstruction Authority, Australia, as Co-Chair. Following speakers of the session are also requested to join the Chair and Co-Chair on the dais. Professor Bilal Ayyub, Center for Technology and System Management, University of Maryland. Professor Fabio Biondini, Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Italy. Mr. Stefan Kohler, Chair of the International Recovery Platform, UNOPS. And Dr. Rajib, Keio University, Japan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Technical Session 2B. Standards are essential for developing disaster-resilient infrastructure. In particular, standards are needed for design and construction of new infrastructure, design of retrofit interventions, as well as maintenance and operation of existing infrastructure. Clearly, higher standards will improve resilience. That was articulated adequately yesterday. But higher standards also cost more for us. So many countries which are represented in this workshop wish to carry home a roadmap for development and implementation of standards, especially for infrastructure appropriate to their nation. But even if they carry back a know-how with them, the shortage of competent and sufficient professionals and skilled artisans to prepare and use the standards, and the absence of effective techno-legal regime to enforce these standards remain to be their challenges. Notwithstanding the existence of such an extreme environment of scarce manpower and improper regulatory framework in many countries, let us embark on this effort during this technical session 2B. Let us find answers to some pointed questions at least, and I'll highlight a couple of them which are relevant to us today. What are the gaps in the existing standards relevant to infrastructure? How often should the standards be updated? How to embed structural fuses in infrastructure which will prevent cascading losses in them? How do we seek and share the engagements of professionals and countries that have the know-how? What are the appropriate strategies for implementing and enforcing the standards in each country? And to lead us to the potential answers to these questions, we have a very distinguished panel here today. I have the co-chair, Brendan Moon, Chief Executive Officer, Queensland Reconstruction Authority, Australia, with us. Alongside, we have four speakers: Professor Bilal Ayyub from the University of Maryland, Professor Fabio Biondini from Politecnico di Milano, Stefan Kohler from UNOPS, Rajib from UNISDR, and I'm also told that we have colleagues from Bhutan and Maldives as well to share their experiences. So we'll get started with the session. First off, we will have the four speakers, then the colleagues from the two countries, and then I'll request our co-chair, Brendan Moon, to take over and steer us through the entire discussion process. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished panelists.
Good morning. I'm happy to be with you again today. Let me just bring my PowerPoint up here. Oops. All right. My presentation today is on climate resilient infrastructure, a manual of practice that's being prepared by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Just a matter of terminology, a manual of practice in ASC terminology is considered to be a step towards the development of a standard. Presently, I'm the chair of the XCOM of the ASC Committee on Adaptation to a Changing Climate, as well as the ASC Infrastructure Resilience Division, and this work brings the two activities together. I'm showing the cover page of the draft that went for review recently, and we are in the process of revising the document based on the comments, favorable comments that we received from the blue panel reviewers. The outline of my presentation is shown in here. I know I have only 10 minutes and I have 20 slides, so I'm going to cover selectively certain slides. First, I'm going to describe the needs and objectives, then the development of this manual of practice, the team, where we stand on its development, and it is a step towards standardization. I'll describe the scope and the outline of the manual, then define some key features or provide information on key features of the manual. The need is stated in this slide. The bottom line, there are requirements on projects where they have to account for a changing climate. And this is coming out, for example, by the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, and so on. So the engineering community does not have guidance on how to deal with the situation. So basically, as engineers, we are trained to use science and math and pretty much provide best judgment in dealing with the situation. So basically, I could call it that the engineering community is improvising, engineers are trained to do that. So what we are trying to do with this effort is to bring those expertise as well as people from academia in order to put together this manual of practice. The project was started last year. It's on a fast track, and we are expecting that it will be released sometime in 2018. The formal title is shown in here, Climate Resilient Infrastructure, a Manual of Practice on Adaptive Design and Risk Management. It finished the Blue Ribbon review. I'm not going through the names of the team that's involved in it, but we have, basically the team does include industry, academia, and government. The reviewers include members of the national academies and so on. The outline, briefly stated, without going through maybe all the subheadings, it starts by setting the context in the introduction, defining the use and so on. Then chapter 2 describes the science in a summarized fashion for the use of engineers. Chapter 3 describes a method which is called the observational method, and I'll give you an example of how this method is used. It's the basis for what's called adaptive design, which is a design philosophy that might be necessary in here. Chapter 4 deals with extremes, the non-stationarity that we have to address when it comes to a changing climate. Then it provides flood design criteria. The focus is really on precipitation and flooding throughout the manual. We do envision that this manual will be updated in future years to account for other hazards and account more for multi-hazards, which is already addressed in the manual, but more can be done. Chapter 6 deals with flood loading, then 7 deals with adaptive design and risk management, data information and sources, which is a frequent question, and there are data is available. Then we have an Appendix A terminology, Appendix B, which is the standards, the ASC standards that will be impacted in here and that are worthy of re-examination. Re-examination in the sense of coverage of the hazards associated with a changing climate. Then we have the other Appendix C, computations of extremes, and Appendix D is adaptation technologies. The last appendix deals with technologies to control flooding and create barriers and so on. Let me just highlight a few things. The engineering practice at the present deals with a life cycle assessment. We would like to get sustainable solutions, sustainable performance, and sustainability, as all you know, deals with it should account for the economics, the environmental aspects of things, as well as the societal needs. Now, a major assumption in engineering is stationarity, meaning anything happened in the past could be used as data for prediction of what will happen in the future. It's still in probabilistic context, but we assume stationarity. Now, all of this is not valid anymore, and anyhow, it wasn't really valid previously. It's an assumption. In reality, stationarity is not with us. We have non-stationary processes. But the fact that we have a changing climate put that issue forward, and we have to deal with it. And we have the analytical tools and the body of math to actually deal with it. The dilemma for engineers is to basically deal with this, what's called deep uncertainty. Meaning, when we deal with climate change, we have various scenarios, projections, assumptions. So the level of uncertainty is quite larger than what we've dealt with before. In the past, when we deal with what's called known unknowns, that I have unknowns, but I characterize them probabilistically, we used a design philosophy which is called robust design. Now, if the unknowns are, we have unknown unknowns, adaptive design will be maybe the way to go. We have a risk framework, which is an adaptive risk framework. I don't have the time to go over the flow chart, but I summarize it through a bulleted list in terms of the steps. It's similar to a typical risk method, but it does involve looping back based on observations to update the risk assessments and re-examine which actions should be undertaken from a set of actions that were already priorly defined during the design stage. The math is described in the manual, and it's basically adaptive design and adaptive risk management falls within the broader context of real options, meaning you design a project and you introduce features in the project that will allow for enhancing the project in the future without undoing what we have done so far. And that's called the real option. There is economic valuation for real options. There is a big, sizable body of literature dealing with real options. Let me skip through the steps in here and just illustrate them with this example. What you see in here basically is, if I have the pointer here, okay. We have, let's say in 2015, that's when the chart was prepared, we predicted what's the 2100 sea level in a particular location. So in 2015, we are predicting the 2100, and there are bands around it. So what we'll do is, if I'm designing a flood wall, I'll set it at the best estimate, not the upper bound or the lower bound. We could set it at higher levels, but let's say if we set it at the best estimate, and then we update our predictions as we move forward along the x-axis, and of course the bounds will be changing. If we find that, let's say, the predictions are showing that we are going to exceed the protection that we set previously, the project itself will have, let's say, the oversized foundation system to handle the increase in height in the flood protection. And that's what you see as the step that happens in the solid line to show that we took the action, let's add more height to this flood wall, but I don't need to go and rip the foundation, remove it, and redo the foundation. There has been several case studies involving what's called adaptive design or using the observational method. One of them is the Los Angeles to San Diego rail corridor, and you could see in here how it's along the coastal line and it's supported by piers. The concept was, by design, is to have an oversized foundation system and allow for the potential of increasing the height if need be, without redoing the project. So that is, there is more details in the source that's cited at the bottom. In terms of concluding remarks, I mean, basically what we have here, what I'm putting forward is the concept of adaptive design and risk management to deal with the uncertainties, the deep uncertainties that we have as a result of a changing climate. This will be a step towards the development of standards, and of course it has to fit within the economics of resilience, as I described yesterday. And the use sometimes of resilience technologies, which I don't have the time to go through them, but we have that covered in one of the appendices. This is an important need, and I know that firsthand from engineering firms, sizable engineering firms, that they would like to see such a manual of practice available. I had side conversations with some of the participants, and that need was expressed to me, meaning the need is not really within the US, but even globally. I could see tremendous benefit in having some form of activity at the international level to advance things further and bring it to the use at the regional level. Thank you for your attention. That's what I have.
Thank you, Professor Ayyub. I now request Professor Fabio Biondini to give his presentation, please.
Chairman, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Fabio Biondini. I'm a professor of structural engineering at Politecnico di Milano. First of all, let me thank all the organizers, and particularly Professor Murty and Mr. Kamal Kishore for their kind invitation to attend this very interesting workshop and to deliver this speech. The purpose of my talk today is to address the importance of life cycle concept in the disaster resilience assessment of aging infrastructure systems, with emphasis on bridges and road networks. We know that structural systems and infrastructure facilities, due to their inherent vulnerability, are at risk from aging, fatigue, and other deterioration processes. These processes are of various types. They are generally interacting and may lead over time to undecided level of performance. And the detrimental effects of these phenomena can be very important, for example, for reinforced concrete bridges and steel bridges under corrosion. And under these severe deterioration scenarios, we may have a problem not only at the operational level under normal service loading, but over time, under continuous deterioration, we may experience also progressive collapse. Now, the problem of aging infrastructure is extremely important for all countries. And here are just two examples. We learned from the report card for American infrastructure issued by the American Society of Civil Engineers that more than 9% of over 600,000 bridges in the country is rated as structurally deficient. The stock of bridges has an average age of more than 40 years, and it is estimated that more than 120 billion is necessary for bridge rehabilitation. This situation is shared by several countries, including Italy. Of course, in spite of the much lower number of bridges, we have, in fact, a similar bridge rating, and many bridges of the main road highway network is now approaching 50 years of lifetime. So the impact, the economic impact particularly of aging and deterioration is enormous, and we have to take this into account by changing our design paradigm. In particular, the classical time invariant design criteria and method need to be replaced by a life cycle approach, where the system is evaluated not at a certain point in time, typically at the initial time when the system is intact, but we have to evaluate it over the entire life cycle. Now, we had extremely relevant advances over the last, let's say, 2 decades in this field, but still we have a gap to be filled between theory and practice, because life cycle concepts and methods are far from being implemented into design practice. And this is mainly due to the fact that these concepts are not incorporated explicitly into design codes and standards. One important aspect in a life cycle approach is to properly model the uncertainty involved in the problem. Here you have an example for this performance profile, you have a performance indicator that is decreasing in time due to deterioration. If a certain target performance is approached, we have the end of life of the system. If we want to extend the life of the system, we have to perform, for example, repair or maintenance, and we have to increase the performance and decrease the deterioration rate. This is an important aspect because when you perform repair intervention, this should be aimed not only to increase the performance, but mainly to decrease the deterioration rate in a life cycle perspective. Here is an example. This is a cable-stayed bridge in Milano, and after 15 years of lifetime, this bridge was repaired. I don't have time to give details, but the repair was aimed at preventing future ingress of aggressive agent into the components of the bridge. Here you can see some stochastic maps of diffusion at the top, at different time instance, at the top without the repair intervention, at the bottom with the repair intervention. On the right bottom side, you have a diagram that shows the evolution in time of the bending strength of the pylon. And as you can see, after 15 years after the repair intervention was carried out, you had a slight increase in the performance level, but mainly a strong decrease of the deterioration rate. And this was extremely effective. Now, looking at the problem at the infrastructure level, bridges are the most vulnerable components of road infrastructure networks, and these networks play a fundamental role in the post-event emergency response, particularly after seismic events. And we are interested not only to evaluate the level of the performance, but also to ensure that the system can recover the original performance and functionality after the event occurs. So we are interested in evaluating the resilience. You have seen this kind of diagrams several times over these 2 days. So we know that we have to evaluate a functionality indicator. After an event occurred, you have a sudden drop of functionality, and after some repair, you will recover the original performance and functionality. And the area under the recovery profile can be considered a measure, a considered evaluation of resilience. Very often, resilience is evaluated with reference to a time-invariant functionality that lead to a time-invariant evaluation of resilience. But resilience is a time-variant indicator, and for aging infrastructure, this is a fundamental aspect. We have to take into account that when you have deterioration of the component into a system, also the system will reduce the functionality over time, and the system has a resilience that is depending on the time of occurrence of the seismic event. Of course, when we have some damage for the bridges into the road network, we have to put some traffic restriction, and this restriction, for example, may involve a weight restriction. We may close a lane or ensure the emergency access only, or sometimes we have to close the bridge, and it may dramatically influence the functionality of the network in terms of traffic capacity. And of course, we will have, as you can see right bottom side, a functionality profile that is constant stepwise, not continuous, as we generally refer to functionality profile, but we have a different level of functionality for each different damage state for each bridge into the system. And another important aspect that we should consider when we evaluate the resilience, the system level is, of course, the hazard scenario. And talking about seismic resilience, if you have a road network with multiple bridges, each bridge may have a different exposure depending on the epicentral distance. And of course, this has to be taken into account if you want to improve the resilience of the system. For example, not only by making some repair of the existing bridges, but you may also improve the network by introducing additional detour, re-entry links, so may you also add some new branches with new bridges. Here you have an example of a network, very simple network with 2 bridges. At the top, you have the resilient maps at different time instance, the initial time, after 25 years, and after 50 years of lifetime. And the map provides the level of resilience depending on the location of the epicenter. And at the bottom side, you have the same maps by considering an upgrade of the network with an additional branch carried out after 25 of lifetime. And you can see how this kind of upgrading can be extremely effective in improving the resilience of the system. I want to mention that an effort is ongoing in order to incorporate life cycle concept in design practice codes and standards within different professional associations. For your information, I want to mention here the International Association for Bridge Maintenance and Safety, the International Association for Life Cycle Civil Engineering, and of course the American Society of Civil Engineers. Within ASC, I want also to bring to your attention this Technical Council on Life Cycle Performance, Safety, Reliability, and Risk of Structural Systems. This council was formed about 10 years ago, and consists of 3 task groups, each one promoting the incorporation of life cycle concept in practice under different perspectives. And this is done under several special projects that are funded by the Structural Engineering Institute, and these projects involve also the development of manuals and guidelines. And I want to mention also this activity that was recently carried out. We made a survey on life cycle performance of civil structure infrastructure system. You can find the full report of this survey in this paper published in the Journal of Structural Engineering that I co-authored with Professor Gianfranco Paul, that was also the founder of the council. And this survey was disseminated among experts in life cycle analysis, and the survey was including about 50 questions under different aspects of life cycle design and assessment. I want to bring here just a few results. For all the respondents, for most of the respondents, life cycle concepts have been rated as extremely important in the respective organization. And for the respondents, what was important in order to promote the incorporation of life cycle concept into design practice was, of course, the increase of awareness of the owners, social and political system, and the industry, but above all, the development of design code standards that are completely missed, and also the development of design guidelines. It is interesting also to note that for less than 25% of the respondents, there are some guidelines in the respective sector regarding life cycle concept. So in conclusion, we need at least 3 ingredients if we want to improve the resilience of our system under a life cycle perspective. We have to fill the gap between theory and practice. We have to develop guidelines and particularly incorporate life cycle concept and method into design code and standards, and we have to increase the awareness of society, political systems, industries, and owners if we want to have long-term disaster resilient infrastructure. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Professor Biondini. I now request Mr. Stefan Kohler to make his presentation, please.
Good morning, and thank you to our chair of the panel and to all the delegates who are attending. As was introduced, my name is Stefan Kohler from UNOPS, and the discussion this morning is going to revolve a little bit just quickly about UNOPS and who we are, because I get a lot of questions about what UNOPS does and who UNOPS is, and then pick up some themes around this topic of standards that are relevant for us as a UN agency, and the fact that we're an operational agency and that we're actually at the kind of forefront of implementing infrastructure projects within the UN system and the countries that we support. So standards play a very important role for us. Just quickly, a snapshot to put it in context about UNOPS. We are an operational arm of the UN, and we basically support implementing partners in peace-building, humanitarian, and development projects. We've delivered over 1,000 projects a year in about 80 countries, so we have a fairly broad global reach of where we work, and it's across multiple contexts and continents, as you can see. In terms of scale of what we do, the organization does about $1.4 billion worth of services work in a year, and this was the figures from 2016. And as you can see, we have a broad range of organizations that we work with. We can work within the UN system, with governments, we can work with multilaterals, with trust funds, intergovernment organizations, international finance institutions. So there's a wide range of actors that we can interact with. And I think that gives us a certain level of neutrality and independence to deliver infrastructure, which also then allows us, as I said, to interact with various organizations, from governments, NGOs, civil societies, and the UN. And all of that is obviously through our mandate, which is primarily in infrastructure, but also how that then supports countries to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's just a quick overview and introduction to put in a little bit of context about UNOPS. The areas that I was asked to talk about very briefly, because we have limited time, was standards, procurement, design review, failure analysis. And you might think these things are all disjointed and how are they related to standards, but they're actually very relevant, and standards permeates through all of them. I just wanted to go back one step, and I think this was covered fairly well yesterday in quite a lot of detail around the thinking about infrastructure, and not infrastructure as assets or static things, but infrastructure as systems. But I'm not sure if we actually articulated what does that mean. What do we mean when we talk about infrastructure as a system? The way we articulate this is 3 dimensions. We talk about the assets, which is the things that we all see, the roads, the bridges, the airports. But then we also talk about the knowledge and the institutions, because no system can function without that. And the institutions are obviously the organizations that are responsible for the design, the procurement, the operation, the maintenance of the infrastructure. Somebody has to own it. And then we have the knowledge piece. And this is where the standards sit. Where do we get the knowledge about this infrastructure? Where do we get the knowledge that actually informs the standards that we are going to apply to a particular set of infrastructure? And here it's not just the institution that owns it, but there are a multitude of players, and it can come from academia, for example, and we've just seen some very good examples of research that's being done that will inform some of the standards that we need to work with. So in UNOPS, we recognize all 3 of these dimensions are very important to infrastructure in the system. And then we also heard about systems of systems and how these systems are all interlinked. And it is a complex chain of things, but I think complexity shouldn't scare us from dealing with this. The next thing we just need to consider when we talk about standards is that infrastructure sits within a context. It's not an isolated thing, and I think we've heard this yesterday. It sits within a socio-economic, environmental, political, societal context within which it operates. And its function is to primarily deliver services and facilitate the flows of goods and deliver those services. And this helps us when we think about standards in terms of, so what do we do to ensure that we continue delivering the services that the infrastructure was supposed to deliver within the context within which it's placed? So having said that, I'll focus a little bit on standards and some of the thinking in UNOPS. And I think standards are really a first line of defense, the way I see it, against shocks and stresses or hazards. And I'm using the resilience terms of shocks and stresses as opposed to hazard, because I think hazards tend to be thought of as short-term instant events, whereas we just heard a very interesting presentation on things like corrosion and deterioration of bridges, which can happen over a long period of time. That's a stress which occurs to the infrastructure. I think what we're trying to achieve with our standards is a level of certainty that actually acts as a risk reduction mechanism or measures, and it's across the entire life cycle. It's not just when we design or build, but there are also standards for operation. There are standards for maintenance. There are standards for regeneration of infrastructure. So we need to think long-term about these standards and how we apply them. Standards are of no use if we don't identify risks, and this has to be done early on in the piece when we're thinking about infrastructure, when we're talking about the feasibility of a project. And we need to make informed decisions. And I hear this term risk-informed being bandied about a lot. And what does that actually mean? It means we have to make conscious decisions about how we remove or eliminate a risk through design and applying a standard. Do we reduce the risk to an affordable level? We'll talk a bit more about this. Or do we just accept the risk? But what we need to do is make conscious decisions. And this is based on the standards that we're going to apply and the performance that we want from our infrastructure. And we heard a little bit about performance of bridges, for example. So what standards are we going to use? And what is key to all of this, and I see this so often in many projects, where project managers will develop a risk register, beautiful document, and then they put it on the shelf, and they never look at it again. I think the key to risk is the word management. And that's about using your risk register to make informed decisions. and using the standards as a guideline for that, because standards are that. Often we think standards are the be-all and end-all, but we can make decisions to exceed those standards if necessary. And in some places we work, standards are not always clear, they're not always relevant, and we have to adapt those standards. So I think we must be very conscious of what we're doing and think about the risks. From a UNOPS perspective, we have many challenges during the construction phase. How do we apply standards? How are we ensuring that standards are being applied? So what the work we're doing with the government of Nepal in the reconstruction process and the assessment of damage to structures after the earthquake, we developed an app called Field Sight, which is a mobile app, which allows people in the field to take pictures of construction and send it back to the office where you have a team of engineers who can actually look at the photographs and who can provide support and advice. Because as we know, the application of standards in remote areas during construction is a huge challenge. So here's an example of what we can do to overcome some of those problems when we're actually having to monitor standards and the application of them in remote areas. Because in fact, if you think about it, the non-application of standards is in itself a risk. The other thing we do around standards is looking at academic partnerships. As the sort of mandated infrastructure agency within the UN, we also need to provide thought leadership on this topic. And so we're working together with Oxford University, and you heard yesterday from Professor Hall, and we're working closely with Oxford on developing the NISMOD model further into a NISMOD International, which is the modeling system that can then be used in the development context within which we work. And there are other institutions that we are working with on climate change. We're looking at specific types of infrastructure for standards and project management methodologies. So infinite resilience is infinitely expensive, but major disasters are very costly. So there's a trade-off we have to make. We need to make decisions, and I think standards provide us with that guidance to make those decisions. And then we can start doing the risk assessments, and then we have to manage those risks and make decisions before we start investing. Which I think is a nice segue into the discussion around procurement. And there's a lot of discussion that happens, particularly in the development world, about doing things quickly. Get on the ground, start building. We want to see concrete in the ground. We want to see people digging foundations. And I understand the urgency of that, and in many cases that is true, and we are driven by financial constraints, and donors often have budget constraints. Financial year ends, they have to spend money by. But just some key thoughts on this, that a project goes through the stages of feasibility, design, then we procure, we construct, and then we operate and maintain. As we saw many examples, the life of infrastructure is 30, 40, 50 years. The design and the feasibility stages can take 6, 12, 18 months. So when you put that in perspective to a 50-year life cycle, you realize it's actually a very short time span. However, what's really interesting is that that is the area where you have the most influence to change things, is in that first window of opportunity. Some interesting statistic from the Asset Management Council of Australia, that 95% of the cost of ownership of an asset over its entire life is locked in at the end of design. So when you're doing a design, it's critical to think about the standards you're applying, the risks you're going to deal with, and we heard some very interesting comments in the very first presentation about this, about design. How do we deal with the unknowns? How do we deal and predict the future, this 50, 60-year lifespan during the procurement stage, and particularly in the design stage? When we're not spending a lot of money, although people think consultants are expensive, wait until you start paying for the construction. But bear that in mind, that often we talk about the cost of infrastructure as the cost of construction. It's a very small portion of the ownership cost, which is what it'll cost you to own it over its entire life. This is where the design review process becomes really important. And it's a key part of the UNOPS processes, and it's mandated in our systems that projects go through a design review process. This is our risk management mechanism, where we have to review designs before we go to tender and to contract. And it's an iterative process. And once again, it helps you understand, is the design that's evolving fit for purpose? Will it deliver the required service to the required standards? Have key risks been identified and managed? Are the appropriate standards being applied? And we need to ensure that that happens, because that's the only way we can ensure that the infrastructure will perform as it's expected to perform. The last thing I want to talk about quickly, and this is something that is also very close to the other hat that I wear, which is as chair of the International Recovery Platform, which is very focused on priority 4 of the Sendai framework. And you'll see the relevance of this, that the concept of build back better is really important for us, because it needs to be rooted, as I said, in this concept of what I call failure analysis. Now, most of us don't like to go back and analyze our failures. I think it's just human nature. We wish to forget them. But when disasters occur, what really happens is we've exceeded the coping capacity of our infrastructure. And it can fail, and it can fail catastrophically. But the real question is, why did it fail? And this is something that I find really interesting, that those of you that have young children will know the 5 whys. You know, Dad, why is the sky blue? Oh, we talk about refraction of the light. And the next question is why, and why. And so this continues until they get to the truth. And I was doing some work in Kenya, and I was asked by the government, we need drainage because the road keeps failing. So I said, why does the road fail? Oh, because the water washes it away. Well, why does the water wash it away? No, because it overtops the drain and that washes the road away. Okay, well, why does the water overtop the drain? Well, because the drains are blocked. Okay, so it's not a road design problem, it's a maintenance problem. Completely different issue. And I think we really need to understand that. What also happens in this process is we learn about the standards that we have applied during the design and whether those standards were appropriate, whether the standards were applied in design, in construction, and then in the operation and maintenance. So it's really critical that we go through a disaster. It costs us a lot of money.
Mr. Kohler?
We should learn from that. I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kohler. I now request Rajib Shah from UNISDR to make his presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and a very good morning to all of you. My sincere thanks and appreciation to NDMA and UNISDR to invite me here. I'm not a civil engineer, so my main perspective of this standard is more on the policy and the governance issue. And with my new role in UNISDR's Science Technology Advisory Group, one of my key emphasis is that how we can promote science into policy and the decision making in the country. I know that it's a standard of any session is the last speaker always get the smallest time. So I put the conclusion right up. So these are my 3 main messages which I would like to focus today. One is that we also heard from my earlier speaker as well as yesterday that we are not possibly talking about individual design, which you used to talk about 30, 40, 50 years back. We are talking about the system design. The number 2 is we possibly need a balance between the visible infrastructure, which is the hard infrastructure, but also the technical, the soft infrastructure, which is more possibly yesterday we had the intellectual infrastructure. So how we can have this balance between the visible and invisible infrastructure. And number 3 is how we talk more on the emerging technology. We heard in the morning from our colleague in Korea that how they are trying to focus on the new technology, especially on the disaster risk reduction. Now let me explain these 3 specific points with some examples from Japan. All of you know that Japan has been in the forefront of the disasters, both experiencing disasters and also having the risk reduction initiatives. I'm talking about the school damages and how the school infrastructure, especially on the different types of design standard, came in Japan. It was there for possibly quite a longer time, but 1968, this Tokachioki earthquake, that has shaken quite strongly the earthquake standards, especially for the school building, when we had a few school building damages, the photographs which you are seeing in the front. And that actually put a very strong standard on what you call the structural or the design standard. The Miyagi-ken Oki in 1978, 10 years after, that time most of the buildings were okay, but we had lots of non-structural damage. The damages of the ceiling, damages, the falling of some of the lights, and other related infrastructure. That actually prompted us to think about what we call the non-structural design and standard. Hanshin-Awaji earthquake, or the Kobe earthquake in 1995, where a big amount of people, they took shelter in the schools, but we faced tremendous problem of the basic utilities, which is the toilet system, the water system, the food in the school. That actually prompted Ministry of Education to think about the functional design or functional standard of the school as a shelter. So what I'm trying to talk about is how we can bring these three things together, structural, non-structural, as well as functional, from the very inception of the design standard. And this is a chart which shows that how over last 16 years, Japan has, or 15 years, Japan, the school buildings, a number of school buildings have been retrofitted with different types of grants and different types of initiatives supported by the Ministry of Education. Now comes the East Japan earthquake and tsunami, 2011. The photograph which you are seeing here is a high school in Rikuzen, Takata. So one of the small city which was affected by tsunami. And of course, all the structural engineers, you understand that there are the structural safety for the earthquake perspective. And this particular building was retrofitted in 2010 July, so just less than 1 year before the tsunami. But what we saw is that this building was not been able to serve as a shelter, and the students, they were taking shelter. What you are seeing in the back, there's a small hillock, which is the baseball game, playground. So that's the place where the students took shelter and they were safe. So again, the location or the spatial standards become very, very important. And this particular building is located 1.4 kilometer from the coastal line. And so it was directly the tsunami wave which hits it. And the similar type of thing we see also many other countries. This is a classic example in Morakot typhoon in Taiwan in 2009, where this whole school, the school was safe, but it was located on the mouth of the valley, so that huge amount of landslide happened and lots of mass movement, which actually affected this particular school. So the point is structural, non-structural, functional, and locational issue, how we can combine these four things, and plus possibly some of the other issues which we heard from our earlier colleagues together, whether it is the adaptive resilience or whether it is the system thinking, so how we can bring it together from the very beginning. So that's my first point. My second point is on this invisible or the soft infra. And this is again a very, very recent initiative. We started in Japan. It's actually less than 1 year old. It was like utilization of internet, media, and artificial intelligence, and try to see that how the communication during the disaster can be effectively used to identify the actual vulnerable areas as well as the specific needs of that. So it's like what we call the post-disaster communication, how we can effective that effectively. This is done with the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication and with some of the national institutes, my university, Keio University, and a few private sectors like Line. Line is it's like WhatsApp, it's the largest SNS provider in Japan with more than 70 million subscribers. Yahoo, Google, SoftBank, Facebook, etc. So what we are trying to see is that nowadays we have lots of communication in the standard time. In the disaster time also, we had quite a bit of different types of SNS which are provided. So how we can utilize the artificial intelligence, we try to find out the effectiveness of this communication and try to see that where the vulnerable people or where the people are trapped in which locations. And of course there are noises, and it's one of the major challenge of this SNS communication, that how we reduce the noise. So it's a very new beginning, and we have now doing some disaster drills for this one, especially in the urban area at different time frame. The peak hours when people commute, or even in the evening hours when people wants to commute back, and in the midday where there are the concentration of the people possibly during the lunchtime and so on. So this is just again what I'm trying to understand here, or what I'm trying to emphasize here, that this type of soft infrastructure or the data infrastructure is very, very important, and how we make a standard design for that, especially using the artificial intelligence as well as different types of new media. That's a very important thing. And my third and last part is how we utilize the new technologies. All of us, we understand, yesterday also there was some emphasis on utilizing of the new technologies, whether it is the robotics, whether it is AI, whether it is the blockchain, or whether it is the drones. So my example here is that how in Japan we are trying to set up some standards for the drones, especially more focusing on the disaster risk reduction. You know that in Japan, there are two major problems, demographic problems. One is the aged population, and another one is the depopulation. The population growth is now negative, so we have shortage of human resources in the major traditional transport sector. Say, for example, whether it is the truck driver or whether it is the maintenance of the social infrastructure. But on the simultaneously, there is a huge demand on the caregiver or different types of other data infrastructure. So one of the key challenges that what we are trying to understand now, that whether this type of new technologies can solve some of the problem. We also understand that yes, it won't solve each and every problem, but at least try to bring this digital divide a little bit smaller. And like in Fukushima, after the Fukushima incident, there has been intensive use of drones for the radiation measurement. Also currently in different fire brigades, the fire engines or fire stations, they are also utilizing drones in different sectors. So there has been a new initiative which called the Drone Pilot Association. And this is a collaboration between the government, Ministry of Land Infrastructure, the academia, which is my university, and the industry, different types of private sectors. And again, the target is that how we can utilize this new technology to develop the standards and the system at the beginning. There have been a few accidents actually recent days, like some of the drones, when it was taking some photographs of a community event, it actually fell down and a few kids actually got injured for that. And that talks about the safety measures which we possibly need to do when we utilize this type of new media. So these drone pilot associations, two specific target is to build a safety infrastructure of drone aviation, and the second one is to develop and harmonize the drone aviation with environment, health, life-saving, and security. So there is an estimation that in next 3 to 5 years, there will be demand of what you are seeing here on the right-hand side, around 140,000 drone pilot. And that's a new job opportunities. And keeping that in mind, there has been schools, drone schools, which have been now authorized, and they are linked to the Ministry of Land Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism. So we have this accredited 30 drone school currently in Japan, and it has, yes, my last slide. So So it's like the accreditation system. There is a market demand, there is an accreditation system, and then there is a licensing system of the drone pilots. My concluding slide is that possibly our earlier colleagues also pointed out this, that we need to have more the adaptive or the dynamic evaluation of the standards, because things are changing. There are new technologies coming up, so we need to keep that up. Possibly, we always face a challenge when we make the standard that where is our back data? And currently, with new technologies, I think the citizen science can play a very, very important role. We heard the example of UNOPS, that in how in Nepal they are using different types of application for the computer application or the smartphone application. So citizen science become very, very important issue for the monitoring. And finally, like possibly we need to have this balance between what I call the demand-driven innovation and innovation-driven demand. In some way, we have to identify what is the demand in the field and try to see that which type of standards actually fits there. But also for certain infrastructure, we need to also think about, for the new infrastructure, as I mentioned about the drone, that this is possibly a new area how we create this demand. With that, thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. I now request our colleagues from Maldives and Bhutan to come up. Do we have information on them, please? Yes. So here's a colleague from Maldives, I understand. Yes, please come. So you would have 5 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. If you can just say your name, please.
Morning, everyone. My name is Mohammed. I'm from Maldives National Defense Force. First of all, I would like to thank Government of India for organizing such a wonderful conference, as well as inviting us to take part in the conference. My brief presentation would be our experience in the field of risk to our country. So it might be a bit different from what we already seen, but I think when it comes for managing risks, every country differs as well. So in the aspect of that, I would briefly speak about the risk management. The country is somewhat like, it's a population, we only have a population of 300,000. It's made up of islands, more than 1,000 islands. Only 194 islands are inhabited, and the 92 resorts, and the capital is Male. As you can see, it's made up of atolls, and then we have islands among each atolls. We do have 26 atolls. The country is less than 1 meter above sea level. I think that's one of the main challenges that we face in our country. When we look into the hazards, we could see that it's different from other type of countries. We are faced with coastal flood, tsunami, extreme heat, cyclones, earthquakes, and however these are mediums as well. We don't face normally earthquakes, but these are the hazards. We were hit by tsunami, 2004 tsunami, and then 13 islands were destroyed. 56 sustained major physical damages, as well as 2,500 houses were destroyed, and more than 3,500 others were severely damaged. As you can see from the picture, you could see an building that's actually an island where this was when we were hit by the tsunami. You could see the level of the sea rise in the impact. That was somewhat like we had a wave which was more than 2 meter wave, but the island is only less than 1 meter above sea level. So this is a big challenge when it comes for resilience in infrastructures as well. 3 islands were washed out, probably maybe because we didn't had good standards, we didn't had infrastructures, we didn't had resilient infrastructures back then. If that was the case, if we had good safety systems, if we had good standards, this might not be the case. When we look back to risk profiling, as I spoke earlier as well, every country has their own risks. Every country differs from the risks as well. Due to our geographical and the way we are, the main hazards for us is tidal waves and urban fires. What you see in the picture about that's the capital, which is like 2 kilometer by 1.5 kilometer, and the capital itself holds more than 30% of total population of the country, which means we already have more than 100,000 people living in a small area. Due to that, we are facing a lot of problems as well. Tidal waves, of course, is one which we can't control, and the other one is the urban fires. When we say urban fires, due to the fact that each fire itself is a load to the buildings as well, and due to the compact, due to the urban population on the island, we are facing that a lot. We do have, when we look into the statistics, we are facing a lot of fires, but then from 2010 to 2017, you might see the figures, it is decreasing. However, the consequences from each fire are high due to the close population. Even if there is one fire in some of the buildings, we can't just eliminate that fire. It is spread into the other infrastructures as well. And this is imposing a lot of danger to everyone around the building. Building itself, the occupancies in the buildings as well. So the main challenges, one of the main challenges that we are facing is the dense population. Due to the constrained lands in our country, it is very difficult for us to implement any standard. Normally, the international standards, the safety standards, they are quite big when it looks into a constraint. If we put in that in our country, it is quite difficult and it is quite expensive as well.
Mr. Mohammed?
Yeah.
It's
Sorry.
time, yeah.
Because of the remote islands, lack of fire safety codes. However, current practice is we are having a building code which came into act last year. Under that act, we are having different codes for different structures to make the structures more resilient as well. Currently, we do practice the international standards. Like I said, we do have, it is quite difficult when it comes to imposing these standards to our countries. But currently, we are working on amending good practices as well as resilient for these structures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I request a colleague from Bhutan to come up, please.
Good morning, everybody. With due permission of Your Excellency, Chair, Co-Chairs, and senior delegates from national, international, and my colleagues, I am Bilal from Bhutan. Would like to talk few points about Bhutan. Before talking about Bhutan, I am very sure that many of here don't know where Bhutan is. I'll talk about Bhutan first. Bhutan is a landlocked country in Asia, north bordered by China and south, east and west bordered by India. It is about 38 38,000 square kilometer, and population twice the Maldives, like 700,000. About the disaster risk scenario, during 2009 and 11 earthquake, Bhutan was affected, some eastern part, southern part, and even it is found that active seismicity in the region. With that initiative, with the Department of Disaster Management and the ministry, with the support from the US aid, we formulated the guidelines in which we found that all damages were in rural areas. And we found that many houses were collapsed and some lives were lost. And we formulated guidelines, and now it is giving the capacity building to the local regions, like up to the village level, with engineers, technicians, and local leaders are involved. With that techniques, we have some restriction in construction in rural areas, like they can't construct building beyond 2 stories. And they need to follow the strict guidelines. Secondly, in Bhutan, we have Bhutan standard rules and regulation for the urban construction, which they need to follow the urban construction. It is incorporated with seismic activity and wind load. And thirdly, Bhutan, many hydropower projects is ongoing. In 2030, there is target of 20,000 megawatts, where there is chance of glacier burst and may cause direct impact. And government need to preparatory action for the matter. And recently there is more roadworks constructions, widening of national highways, construction of district roads, and construction of village roads, where due to terrain there is many blockage and landslides occurs in monsoon, where this is tackled in ad hoc matters. So this also need to take in action for preparatory. Direct role is taken by the disaster management, and all districts are appointed district administrator as a direct role during the disaster, and armed forces and polices. With this, I would like to thank very much for the Government of India for organizing this workshop and getting opportunity to share our views. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now request our co-chair to make his comments as well as to take the discussion forward.
Thank you, Chairman. On behalf of the Australian Government, I would wish to acknowledge the leadership of the Indian Government and also the UNISDR in bringing together the key leaders at the forefront of thinking about demonstrating and implementing disaster risk reduction and also resilient infrastructure into the future. We're honoured to be able to contribute to this discussion about the development of disaster resilient infrastructure. But what strikes me is that no matter where we come from or what part of the globe that we originate from, is there are consistent themes emerging across this particular workshop. And that is that we are all in this process of recovering and having the conversation about how we reconstruct assets and communities after the impact of significant events. We too, in Australia, are in the process of recovery after the second most damaging cyclone across the Australian coast since records began. And what is clear is that we are all experiencing this massive climate variability in terms of duration and impact and intensities, at the same time as our ability to build bigger and more complex infrastructure is increasing. Our systems are becoming more advanced, interdependent and interrelated. And at the same time, because I'm intimately involved in this recovery process, the expectations of our communities are heightened in terms of the expectations in how quickly we can reinstate infrastructure after an event, whether it is making them more safe in the event of a new climate-based risk, and how are we reducing the cost of reconstruction and recovery for future events. These are some of the key challenges that we face in Australia, and certainly from the discussion that I have been a party to here in the last 2 days, there are obviously consistent themes across this particular group as well. A challenge in the Australian context, and I think it has been raised in a number of presentations here, is that our infrastructure networks not only deal with advanced, urbanised, very well supported communities within the economy, our cities, but it also includes rural and remote communities who also rely very, very heavily on an infrastructure network that enables them to function as a community. And so I think it's very, very important that when we talk about standards, when we talk about resourcing of capability, of those technical standards of design principles, that we take into account when we're talking about resilient infrastructure, that we actually incorporate not only new infrastructure, but we also look at those existing infrastructure networks as well. So probably some of those key questions that have arisen today, and also we confront regularly, is how do we incorporate the growing complexity and granularity of a hazard and risk assessment into design, construction, operations and maintenance standards? Whilst this is included in most large infrastructure projects, is how do we translate those into more lower scale, smaller remote communities? Andrew Maskery made an important point yesterday, which was that we need to build models that are available to all. And I think that's very, very important for those rural and remote communities that all of us have in our particular part of the globe. Today, my 4 key takeaways from the presentations of our panel today, and hopefully that will generate a little bit of discussion, is that Professor Ayyub has conspicuously noted that rather than designing to existing national and international standards, we should think beyond standard. We should be looking at integrating resilience. He used a very, very prescient term, adaptive design principles. And I think that should underpin most of our thinking in terms of how we look at best practice guidelines rather than prescriptive guidelines. Give the ability to our designers to take into account the changing pace of the data that we're receiving in terms of climate risk. And so the question then went on to, are our operations and maintenance standards adequate for the risks we now face? And Professor Biondini made an important point that should underpin any resilient design for infrastructure, and that is we should take the complete life cycle approach from not only design, we should go all the way through construction, also operations and maintenance, and then recovery, reconstruction, or replacement. Stefan Kohler, who has been intimately involved in the delivery of projects throughout the world, suggested that we need to take that systems approach. Importantly, what stood out for me is that we not only dealt with the asset themselves, that we dealt with those soft parts of the equation, the knowledge bank and the institutions. And it's probably something that we need to touch on and explore further in maybe further discussions. Is that how do we develop that capability amongst our engineers, amongst our standards, and how do we actually identify best practice throughout the world and export that sort of capability to other parts of the world that require it? And Dr. Shaw finally indicated that taking that multidisciplinary approach should underpin any strategy for increasing the resilience of infrastructure, including a conversation about land use planning, including that introducing and including the conversation about what is climate science telling us about the state our operations and maintenance and our standards should look like. And also the disaster management sector as well as the engineering sector. This multidisciplinary approach should underpin our investment in resilient infrastructure into the future. So they were the 4 key takeaways I had from the presentation today. What I would like to do is open the discussion to the floor, because I think we have many, many contributors here, especially on the importance of design, the operations and maintenance posture we take for our particular infrastructure networks.
Can somebody help her with the mic, please?
Hello, hi, good morning. I'm Anna Bruni. I'm a chartered civil engineer and I'm also a trustee of the Habit Foundation. My question to the panel today is around what can we do to prepare ourselves for unknown risks. So I was really pleased to hear some of the panelists explode some of the challenges that designers and engineers face in preparing and sort of setting the targets that we plan for our structures, and also some of the opportunities that we can exploit when we foresee some of the risks, and therefore we set a good design basis. But what can we do to prepare ourselves for the scenarios where, for no fault of a structure or of a piece of infrastructure, the context changes, and therefore the baseline conditions that the structure was designed for and the way it's operated are no longer suitable? And where does that responsibility lie? Does it lie with the operators of the structure, or does it lie with, for example, the agencies managing change? I think a similar example was mentioned yesterday in relation to a dam, where the outflow allowed for the dam that was planned for might have been different to the capacity downstream that was changing. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I could see a role for adaptive design if the design has appropriate features to enable changes in it with a reasonable level of costs. I think this could maybe address changes in the requirements as well as in the operations. It doesn't really address all the potential scenarios here, but it could offer a way to deal with a good number of them. And this could be done through a deliberate design early on, where those potential changes are examined and considered during the design stage.
We have been discussing about the recurring losses we have been incurring, and the standards and what you have been discussed here will help all the countries to at least minimize these things. And these standards what are developed in various countries, how they are being available globally to the various agencies. I hope there is no commercial aspects involved in this compared with the losses we are incurring at the country level. So how to make these things available easily, like today we have Google Maps, where every person can access it and benefit from that. The design standards, the maintenance practices, how to make them available to each country or to the individuals so that we can minimize these losses.
I think that, and it's a good question, and we have had this comment in some of the countries we work where there is this issue of access to standards. And I think one of the things we're trying to do as a UN agency is develop best practice guidelines internally that we can then share with countries and member states to use. And UNOPS has developed a set of guidelines around prisons, for example. We're doing infrastructure as well, bridges, roads, which draws on some of that knowledge from around the globe to do that, to make it available. But I believe there are some challenges with that, and I have heard this from people in Nepal, the same thing, that accessing some of the standards becomes costly. But obviously there's a cost associated with maintaining the standards and with keeping them up to date, and the sort of infrastructure needed to maintain them. So we have to obviously understand that and how we balance that. But certainly we are working on that to make those kinds of things available.
This is a very good question. Let me just give you additional information in the way ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers operates. ASCE, when we undertake a project to prepare standards, is done all by volunteers. So basically in the manual of practice that we are working on, we had about 12 individuals volunteering to draft it. They have no financial interests or gains out of this other than maybe professional advancement. Now for the society, for ASCE, they will end up selling it as a book, as a document, and that's not really I don't think it can be offered free of charge, and the reason behind it, ASCE has a staff to maintain and so on. There are basic costs they have to be maintained. So those standards, they tend to be offered for some nominal charge. I mean, they're not that expensive, and they could be available through institutions. If there is a library for a university and so on, most of the time they have institutional subscriptions and they have access to such documents.
The lady there first, please, and then.
Is it on? So my question was basically about the multi-governance system in relation to India, and perhaps Professor Murty, you could help answer this question. So yesterday we talked about how local capacity was missing, but we didn't really address the fact that, and I can only really speak about the case of India, that there are legal frameworks in place where the central government has authority over some things, for example, national highways in India, but that national highway, when you're driving across it, will go off into a state road at one point, and the central government does not have any authority over that state road because that is a state subject. Now, does that come down to the state not having capacity? Does that come down to the center not coordinating with the state, or does that just come down to this is the state subject, this is the center subject, and this is just how it is? And is the only solution an amendment to the Constitution, or are there better ways to do it? And this is something perhaps you could answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Since she has given it to me directly. National Highways Authority, when the land is given for development of roads and the bridges along that, is also given the authority to execute it from end to end. So there's no conflict per se with any state or rural road or anything. It just has the full right of way defined, and it can do the full design and construction by itself. So there's no conflict that way. When national highways, same as the case with Indian Railways. Oh, sure. That continues. There's an owner, and the owner is responsible for that. Sure. So there's need for coordination. That is clear. There's need for coordination. Often that is where the emphasis has to be laid, and we have to work harder on that. Yeah.
Sir. So I'm.
Where's the next question? Right here. Right here.
Yeah, thank you. I think the other issue, which I don't think's been perhaps raised at the table, is what happens in contexts where you have the standards exist, you have highly trained engineers who understand the standards, but what is actually built then doesn't conform to what was in the design. So actually what I'm saying is what happens in the whole process between the design and actually the infrastructure existing. Certainly, I was a senior advisor to the Peruvian government in the second half of last year in the reconstruction after the floods. Most of the problems we were facing weren't actually on the lack of standards. The problems was in the procurement process, particularly at the local level, and then the different sort of changes, let's say informal changes to designs that happened between the original design and the construction happening. So I think there's a series of, let's say, institutional issues, particularly at the level of local administrations, which can quite easily, let's say, pervert the original intention of the standards and the design, which then may mean that what, at least on paper, might seem to be resilient infrastructure when it's built is not resilient infrastructure. So there's a sort of, let's say, outside of the realm of the engineering professions, there's the whole other realm of public administration, which I think we also have to look at in terms of how the whole system works, which I think is a point that Stefan made in his presentation.
Well, I think it's obviously a very critical question, because I think this is something that, I've seen personally in countries where you're right, there's a very strong national building code. It's used by the engineering profession to do the designs, and then when that design is handed to a contractor to implement, then the capacity of the contracting community to actually do the implementation according to the design for multiple reasons is not there. Or sometimes there's a financial incentive not to comply with the design because it's perceived to be too expensive. And then shortcuts are taken. And I think this comes down to two real big issues. The one is the issue of quality assurance and quality control and how we actually do that. And the other one is you're right. I think it's part of the institutional component of the systems. And the institutions is not just the designer of the assets, but it's also those institutions that construct them, that work with them, that own them and operate them. Because we've also seen where even if the design is constructed to code, the way the building, for example, is operated is not to code. And that's just as big as a problem. So there needs to be kind of institutional strengthening across all the areas, not just the constructors or the designers of the assets. But it is a real issue. That causes us major problems.
Yeah, just to supplement, I think the way I see it is it's like a nutrition guide and a recipe or a cookbook. At certain stage, we need to have very specific nutrition guide, which will possibly give us the broader perspective. And that is very much related to the technical standard. But when we actually implement that standard, I think this is more like a recipe or the cookbook that how at different country, different contexts, they actually do that. And yes, I fully agree with what Stefan had pointed out and in his presentation as well as your comment. And there possibly we have lots of new innovations or lots of issues which can be shared across the country. So one of my biggest wish and expectation from this conference also would be that when we talk about this DRI, Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Alliance, at certain point possibly we need to think about some mechanism that how we can share not only just the success stories, but some of how we can learn from the failures. So I think that would be a very, very important issue.
Okay, so that will be the last two questions.
Sir,
one
yeah.
there.
Sir, I am representing Tata Power. We are supplying power to Mumbai. This is power utility. And power business is heavily regulated. Those who have got standard, we want to implement the standard. We have to go to a regulator, and regulator normally sees it should be economy because this is a public service. So how to implement the standard plus how to give this service to people with the economics. That is a challenge which we are facing. So we request all these delegates from national, international, that they should, through government policies or through regulatory policies, they should make people understand that our infrastructure should be disaster resilience, and it will implement it to regulatory regulator to these standards.
Okay. So that was more like a suggestion, but anybody wants to respond on that? Yeah, sure, please.
I could see that, thank you for your question, I could see that there are almost three layers. One is policy, and the policy will drive the regulation. The standard creation community is really separate. They will offer those standards, and it's left up to the regulator to adopt them. At least that's the way it works in the US. For example, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that regulates the design and construction of nuclear power plants, they have the say and the authority whether they should adopt the ASME standard. So it's very common that NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they might be in a time lag behind the standard, the ASME standard. The ASME standard might be, let's say, the version that is 2015, while the regulator is still adopting the 2003 version of that standard. There is a time lag of this time. But NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will be responding to the policy that's set by law. Thank you.
So we'll go to the last question on the floor. Okay, if not, I'll request Bren Moon to close the session, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think we're all agreed that more resilient infrastructure, the systems that support it, are what we seek to achieve. But I think importantly what today's session has certainly identified, that there are three key components to that. It's about understanding asset performance, it's about having those standards that support how they will behave during a disaster, but also importantly, and I think I highlighted the need for further engagement in subsequent workshops, is that knowledge and institutional piece is that if we're truly to have disaster resilient infrastructure, then we certainly need to look at how we actually capture those lessons. Best practice, capture them, deliver them to areas that need them most. And institutionally, we've touched on it, how do we actually ensure that disaster resilient infrastructure is delivered within the policy settings and the funding settings that we currently have. I'd like to thank all the contributors here from the panel. They've certainly given us the benefit of their many, many years in this space, and I'd certainly appreciate the engagement from the attendees at the workshop in the Q&A session. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone.
Now I invite everyone for tea and coffee and request to kindly reassemble in 15 minutes.